I didn't notice the woman beside me until the plane began to move, but the moment her trembling hand gripped my wrist, I knew my life was about to split into before and after. Her eyes were wide with terror, her lips almost colorless, and though the cabin was full of daylight pouring through the windows, she looked like someone hiding in the dark. Then she leaned close enough for only me to hear and whispered that the man 3 rows behind us was her ex, that he had followed her through security, and that if I didn't help her, she might not make it off that flight free. Before this story continues, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that one stranger can become someone's lifeline, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel Lifeline Diaries. Your support helps stories like this reach hearts that need them. My name is Kieran Vale, and that morning, I had boarded Flight 318 from Phoenix to Seattle with nothing heavier on my mind than a missed breakfast and the sharp ache of grief I had been carrying since my mother's funeral 2 weeks earlier. It was a bright day, the kind that made airport glass shine like water, and everyone around me seemed to be rushing towards something important. I was only trying to get through the day without falling apart. I had chosen a window seat because I didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want anyone asking why my eyes looked tired or why I kept touching the small silver bracelet in my pocket, the last thing my mother had given me. But then Soraya Wren sat beside me, and without meaning to, she pulled me back into the world. At first, I thought she was simply nervous about flying. She kept glancing over her shoulder, pressing her fingers into the edge of her boarding pass until it bent, and breathing like every inhale hurt. She was in her early 30s, with dark curls pinned messily under a beige scarf and a faded denim jacket buttoned wrong, as though she had dressed in a hurry. Her suitcase was small enough to fit under the seat, and when it tipped open slightly, I saw a child's stuffed fox tucked inside, worn at the ears. That was when I understood this wasn't ordinary fear. This woman had run from something. The man behind us did not look dramatic or dangerous at first glance. That was what frightened me most. He wore a clean navy shirt, expensive watch, and the calm expression of someone who expected the world to move aside for him. He smiled when the flight attendant passed, but his eyes stayed fixed on Soraya. Not constantly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough. Every few minutes, his gaze landed on the back of her head like a hand around her throat. Soraya told me her name in fragments, barely moving her mouth. She said she had left her ex, Corvin Hale, after 7 years of being controlled, isolated, and slowly convinced she was worthless. She had a daughter named Mira waiting with Soraya's sister in Seattle. She had planned her escape for months, changed phones, sold jewelry, saved cash inside an old flour tin, and bought the earliest daytime flight she could find because she thought the crowds would protect her. But Corvin had appeared at the gate with that soft, polished smile she feared more than yelling. He had not touched her. He had not threatened her where cameras could see. He had simply boarded the same plane. I looked at my own hands and realized they were shaking too. I was not brave by nature. I was a furniture restorer, a man who fixed cracked wood and broken chair legs, not lives. But my mother's voice rose in my memory, gentle and stubborn, telling me that courage rarely feels like courage while it is happening. Sometimes it just feels like being scared and staying anyway. So I leaned back, looked straight ahead, and told Soraya in a low voice that she was not alone anymore. For the first hour, nothing happened, and somehow that made the fear worse. The plane climbed through clean blue sky, sunlight spread over the wing, and passengers settled into ordinary rituals. A teenager watched a movie. A man across the aisle snored with his mouth open. A little boy asked for apple juice. The normalness of it all felt cruel, because beside me Soraya sat frozen, as if one wrong movement could summon disaster. I asked the flight attendant, a sharp-eyed woman named Maribel, for water, and when she leaned down, I quietly said the passenger next to me needed help and was afraid of a man behind us. Maribel's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened. She nodded once, like she understood more than I had said. After that, small things began to shift. Maribel checked on us more often. Another attendant stood in the aisle longer than necessary. Soraya's breathing slowed, but then Corvin stood up and walked toward the front restroom, passing our row slowly. His fingers brushed the top of Soraya's seat as he went by, and her entire body recoiled. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. When he returned, he paused beside us and smiled down at me as if we were old friends, saying in a pleasant tone that Soraya got confused when she was anxious and that he would take care of her when we landed. The words were polite, but the meaning beneath them was cold. Something inside me broke open then, maybe grief, maybe anger, maybe every helpless moment from my mother's illness when I had watched someone I loved suffer and could not stop it. I looked at Corvin and told him that Soraya was traveling with me. My voice was steady, which surprised me. He stared at me for a long second, and in that second I saw the mask slip. His eyes became flat and furious. Then he smiled again and returned to his seat. Soraya began crying silently. Not loud sobs, not the kind people notice, but tears that fell as if they had been waiting years for permission. She told me she used to be a teacher before Corvin made her quit. She told me he monitored what she wore, who she called, how long she spent at the grocery store. She told me she had once believed love meant patience, forgiveness, endurance. Then her daughter had started flinching whenever Corvin raised his voice, and Soraya finally saw the future clearly. She had not run for herself alone. She had run because Mira deserved a home where laughter did not require permission. The flight felt endless. Every announcement from the cockpit made time stretch thinner. Maribel returned with a napkin tucked under Soraya's cup, and on it she had written 3 words, "Police at arrival." Soraya read it and pressed the napkin to her chest like a prayer. For the first time, color returned faintly to her face. Outside the window, mountains rose beneath us, white and blue and distant, and I thought about how strange it was that a person could be crossing the sky while fighting for the right to live on Earth. When the plane began descending into Seattle, Corvin became restless. He unbuckled before the sign turned off, reached into the overhead bin too early, and ignored the attendant's warning until Maribel stood beside him with a firmness that made half the cabin look up. Soraya gripped my sleeve. I told her to keep her eyes on the window, on the daylight, on anything except him. The wheel struck the runway hard, and the cabin erupted in the usual noise of phones turning on and seat belts clicking, but Maribel's voice came over the speaker asking all passengers to remain seated due to a safety matter. People groaned, confused and impatient. Corvin did not groan. He stared at Soraya. Then 2 airport police officers stepped onto the plane. What happened next was not like the movies. There was no dramatic chase, no shouting confession. It was quieter and more terrible. Corvin tried to charm them. He said it was a misunderstanding. He said Soraya was unstable. He said he was her partner, then corrected himself and said former partner. But Soraya stood up with Maribel beside her and me on her other side, and with a voice that shook but did not break, she said she was afraid of him, that he had followed her, that there were reports, messages, and a protective order pending back home. The officers asked Corvin to step out. His face changed then, not into fear, but disbelief, as if the world had betrayed him by listening to her. As he passed us, he leaned just close enough to whisper something I could not hear. Soraya heard it, and for one awful second, I thought she would collapse. But she didn't. She lifted her chin. She looked at him fully for the first time on that flight, and whatever power he still believed he had over her seemed to weaken beneath that look. He was escorted away in the bright tunnel of the jet bridge, and the daylight swallowed him. Inside the airport, Soraya's sister arrived with Mira. I will never forget that child running across the arrivals area, her small sneakers flashing, the stuffed fox's twin clutched in her arms. Soraya dropped to her knees before Mira reached her, and they collided into each other with a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I stood a few steps away, holding my carry-on, suddenly aware that my own eyes were wet. Soraya's sister thanked me again and again, but I had no words big enough for the moment. I had done so little, really. I had stayed. I had believed her. I had helped make sure others believed her too. Before we parted, Soraya pressed the bent boarding pass into my hand. On the back, she had written a phone number and one sentence: "You reminded me the world still has safe people in it." I kept that boarding pass in my wallet beside my mother's bracelet, because both reminded me of the same truth. Love is not always grand. Sometimes love is a stranger lowering his voice in a crowded plane. Sometimes it is a flight attendant reading fear without being told the whole story. Sometimes it is a woman choosing freedom with trembling hands. Months later, Soraya sent me a photo. She was standing in a classroom, smiling in front of a chalkboard, with Mira's drawing taped beside her desk. She had started teaching again. Her message said the first morning she walked into that school, she almost turned back because she still heard Corvin's voice in her head telling her she was nothing. But then Mira squeezed her hand and said they were safe now. Soraya wrote that healing was not a straight road, but at least now it was her road. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Lifeline Diaries. Someone watching may need to be reminded that kindness can arrive in the seat beside them, even on the hardest day of their life. Special request: comment "Be someone's lifeline" if you believe one act of courage can change a life. I used to think heroes were people who felt no fear. Now I know better. Heroes are often frightened people who refuse to look away. That day, on a bright morning flight above the clouds, a stranger asked me to save her from her ex. But in saving her, she gave something back to me too. She reminded me that even when grief makes the world feel empty, there is still work for our hearts to do. There are still hands reaching out in silence. There are still lives waiting to begin again. And sometimes, the smallest answer, spoken softly between two strangers, can become the beginning of someone's freedom.